In 2015, England had a flooding problem it could not solve, but the Devon Wildlife Trust proposed a solution that sounded insane. On March 23rd, they released beavers into the River Otter. The species had not lived in an English river for over 400 years. At first, there were 2 family groups. 5 years later, there were 15, but what happened next did not fit the original models. Before the 16th century, Devon's valleys moved differently. Rivers were slower not because of terrain but because of who lived in them. For millennia, beavers slowed water with their dams, turning steep mountain streams into mosaics of ponds and waterlogged meadows. Water did not rush to the sea. It stayed in the valleys for weeks and months, soaking into the ground and feeding plants far from the banks. Then came the first wave. Beavers were hunted for their fur and for castoreum, a fatty secretion from their glands that apothecaries across Europe used as a painkiller. Demand was steady and relentless. By the end of the 1500s, not a single beaver remained in England. There was no date, no witness to the last kill. The species simply vanished from the records. But the rivers still remembered their shape. Ponds gradually silted up, dams washed away in floods, the floodplain meadows held on for a while. The second wave came more slowly and was worse for it. Without beavers to slow the water, rivers began cutting their banks deeper. Water that had once spread across the floodplain now raced straight to the sea. Farmers drained the wet meadows for pasture, and this seemed rational because the water no longer lingered anyway. The complex wetland systems did not disappear in a year or a decade. They disappeared across generations, slowly enough that no one noticed the loss. The third wave was not an event, it was a condition. Each new generation accepted a narrower, faster, impoverished river as the norm. By the 20th century, English hydrologists were building flood models based on river behavior without beavers, treating that as the baseline. A narrow channel, steep banks, swift current. This did not look like the consequence of 4 centuries of one species being absent. It was simply England as they knew it, as their parents and grandparents had known it, and that normalcy, not the hunting, not the drainage, turned out to be the hardest thing to reverse. When photographs taken by a local resident named Tom Buckley reached the press in February 2014, the government's response was swift and unambiguous. The beavers should be trapped and removed. The Environment Agency pointed to disease risks, specifically echinococosis, a parasite that beavers can carry and that is dangerous to humans and livestock. This was not paranoia. Infection rates had been documented in some continental populations, and nobody knew the status of the Devon animals. The Angling Trust, representing around 900 fishing clubs across England, took a separate but equally grounded position. The organisation stated that beaver reintroduction posed serious risks to fisheries, the threat of flooding and landscape change, and called for the animals to be removed. The argument was specific. Atlantic salmon and sea trout migrate upriver to spawn. Their populations in southern England had been declining for decades. At that point, spawning salmon populations in Britain had fallen roughly 50% against the 10-year average. Adding an animal that builds barriers across river channels from the angler's perspective meant deliberately worsening an already critical situation. Farmers in the lower Otter Valley had a third argument, the simplest of all. Their fields already flooded every winter. David Lawrence, whose farm at Nightstone sat directly near where the animals had been found, publicly supported the beavers. He occupied relatively higher ground. Those whose fields lay further downstream saw the situation differently. Their concerns proved not unfounded. Over 5 years, the beavers caused damage to farmland at 5 sites. In one case, an organic potato field was completely inundated. Orchards along the banks were protected with wire mesh to prevent gnawing. The government pressed for removal, but public opinion intervened. The journalist and environmentalist George Monbiot wrote in The Guardian that the authorities were behaving like control freaks. He noted that most anglers in his experience have a deep connection with nature and that the Angling Trust did not represent their view on this question. Petitions in support of the beavers gathered thousands of signatures, surveys conducted near the River Otter, and nationally in 2017 found that 86% of 2,741 people supported beaver reintroduction. By 2019, repeat surveys found that figure had risen to 90%. Buckley acted alone. He printed posters that read "Save our beavers" and put them in shop windows around Ottery St Mary. A retired man who simply took daily walks along the river became the public face of the campaign. Without an organization, without a budget, with a camera trap and a sheet of paper, Lawrence himself came out against removal. The animal lived on his land, the damage he described as minor, and his tone was more surprised than worried. But that isn't the end of it. In March 2015, the government changed its position, but only after receiving specific answers to specific questions. 5 adult beavers trapped for medical examination were released back into 2 stretches of river on March 23, 2015. During the winter of 2014 to 2015, the trapped animals were tested twice. First, DNA analysis confirmed the Eurasian subspecies native to Britain rather than an introduced American one. Then they ran a test for echinococcosis, the parasite that had driven the government's demand for removal. The animals were clean. The skeptics had set specific scientific conditions. The conditions were met. The license passed, not despite the opposition, but through it. Devon Wildlife Trust received a 5-year license from Natural England. The condition was annual reporting, continuous monitoring, and a clear understanding that if the data came back negative, the program would be stopped. It looked like a compromise nobody was happy with. The license had been granted, but only on strict terms. For 5 years, a team led by Professor Richard Brazier of the University of Exeter gathered data across the entire River Otter catchment, 594 kilometers of waterways, quarterly field visits, and annual public reports. In parallel, Devon Wildlife Trust in 2016 added another pair of beavers to the population, a male and a female genetically unrelated to the main group, to ensure diversity and extend the range into the Rivertail tributary. In February 2020, the final science and evidence report was published. 3 key numbers. In October 2019, researchers counted 28 dams backing water up across just 1.9 kilometers, 0.3% of the total waterway length in the catchment. None of them stood on the main River Otter channel. They were only on small tributaries and side channels. The anglers' concerns about blocking the main migration route had not materialized. Then something happened that nobody had expected. Surveys showed that ponds formed by beaver dams contained 37% more fish than comparable reaches without dams. And third, one beaver family had built 6 dams upstream of East Budleigh, a village that regularly suffered winter flooding. Peak flood flows through the village measurably decreased. A 4th result in the report stood apart. At a site where beavers had built 13 dams, researchers documented large-scale filtration of agricultural pollutants, manure, slurry, and fertilizer. The ponds were settling suspended particles to the bottom. The water downstream was becoming cleaner. This effect had not been part of the project's brief either. 5 years of detailed research allows us to conclude that the benefits of beavers have outweighed the costs, Brazier said, but the report also makes clear those who gain from reintroduction are not always the same people who bear the costs. Reducing flood risk in settlements downstream may come at the price of water backing up onto farmland upstream. The Angling Trust published a statement in August 2020 when the government announced its decision. Mark Owen, the organisation's head of freshwater, said that serious concerns remained about the impact of beaver releases on protected migratory fish species, salmon and sea trout. He said the Trust was disappointed that the minister did not wait for the Trust's report before reaching a decision. The organisation commissioned an independent assessment of beaver impacts on fish from its own experts. The disagreement between the two groups of scientists continued for years after the project officially concluded. The question of fish had been considered the most dangerous concern from the start. It had kept the project under threat of closure longer than anything else. But the data told a different story, not the one either side had expected. Researchers documented trout jumping over beaver dams during high water periods. None of the dams stopped migration on the main channel. The most unexpected finding was something else entirely. Juvenile fish, young trout and salmon were actively colonizing the ponds behind the dams. The slow, deep, cooler water gave them what straight river reaches could not provide: shelter from predators, abundant food from insects and mollusks, and lower temperatures. In summer, when open stretches of the river warmed to levels critical for juvenile fish, the ponds stayed cooler. The report recorded that the effect of beaver presence on other wildlife became one of the most pronounced results of the study, creating new areas of wetland habitat that benefited amphibians, waterfowl and water voles. Water vole numbers, a species that had been disappearing across England for decades, began recovering on the Otter stretch. This had not featured in any of the project's original targets. Nobody had set out to restore water voles. They simply appeared where banks of the right structure had appeared. In August 2020, the British government announced that beavers could stay and naturally spread to other catchments. It was the first legally sanctioned reintroduction of an extinct native mammal in England. The population grew from 2 breeding pairs in 2015 to 15 family groups by 2020 without any targeted resettlement. Beavers expanded on their own from the Otter into the River Tail and several smaller tributaries. By 2022, beavers had appeared in the Coleman X catchments in the same county. A wider network was taking shape in parallel. In 2020, beavers were released into the Hatchmere Nature Reserve in Cheshire. In 2021, they were released onto the South Downs and into Dorset. In April 2019, 2 adult beavers entered an enclosure in Cropton Forest in Yorkshire. Within a few years, their family had grown to 10, and in 2022, the eldest daughter moved to the Sculthorpe Moor Reserve in Norfolk, where she established a new colony. In October 2022, the beaver was granted the status of European protected species in England, the same legal protection as the bat, the otter and the wild cat. This meant that trapping, injuring or destroying a beaver without a special license became a criminal offence. In February 2025, the government opened the way for open releases across England. The first such licence was issued on February 10th, 2025 to the National Trust for a project in Purbeck, Dorset. The licensing system that followed reflected lessons learned from a decade of contested data. Any organisation seeking to release beavers into the wild was required to submit a project plan covering a minimum of 10 years, including an exit strategy for both successful delivery and early termination. The first application window opened on March 3rd, 2025 and closed on May 2nd, 2025. In February 2026, Natural England announced 2 further licence projects and launched an online mapping tool for assessing potential new sites across the country. A decision that in 2014 had seemed impossible had travelled from a single camera trap to a national licensing system in 12 years. Only 14% of rivers in the United Kingdom were in good ecological condition when the trial began. The Devon experiment wasn't an isolated curiosity. It was a test case for a system in widespread failure. Mark Elliott, who led the Devon Wildlife Trust project throughout all 5 years, said after the report's publication that they were all surprised by the ability of these animals to thrive again in our wetland ecosystems. It also demonstrates their unrivaled ability to breathe new life into our rivers and wetlands, most of which are in a poor state. David Lawrence, the farmer on whose land Tom Buckley placed a camera trap in 2014, never changed his position. He had said at the time that perhaps some fallen trees would need clearing to prevent problems downstream. The clearing never happened. The beavers redistributed the material themselves to where it was needed. 28 dams, 594 kilometers of waterways, 0.3% blocked, 37% more fish in places where nobody had planned to restore any.